A woman stood in the center of the courtroom, her hands steady, her gaze unwavering. Across the aisle, the man who once vowed to love her smirked, convinced of his inevitable victory. He had power, money, and influence. She had silence, or so he thought. But when she finally spoke, the truth shattered his world, piece by piece. The judge's gavel struck the block, sending a sharp crack through the hushed courtroom. All eyes were on her. Olivia Carter had spent over a decade building a life with Ethan Reed, a man who now sat relaxed in his chair, confident that the legal system, and his millions, would wipe her away like an inconvenient footnote. His lawyer leafed through stacks of papers, preparing to paint her as nothing more than a privileged housewife who contributed nothing. The media whispered about the case, labeling it just another billionaire discarding his wife for a younger model. The spectators waited, expecting another woman to walk away empty-handed. But Olivia wasn't just another woman. She had been underestimated for too long. Her voice, calm yet firm, cut through the silence. "Your Honor, I have evidence that will change everything." She placed a file on the table, a file her ex-husband never saw coming. In that moment, Ethan's smirk faltered. Because he had no idea that the woman he had dismissed as useless had been the one holding up his empire all along. Olivia hadn't always been the woman standing in that courtroom, holding the weight of years of dismissal and betrayal in her hands. Once, she had been something else, someone else. A woman who believed in love, in partnership, in the dream of building something great together. She met Ethan Reed in college, back when he was just another ambitious student with big ideas and a relentless drive. They were young, passionate, and unstoppable. While their friends spent weekends partying, Olivia and Ethan spent theirs mapping out business strategies on the floor of their tiny apartment. She had a sharp mind for numbers, an instinct for investments, and a talent for seeing opportunities where others saw risks. When Ethan landed his first major deal in real estate, Olivia was right there beside him, reviewing contracts and calculating long-term projections. He called her his secret weapon, his most trusted advisor. At the time, she believed him. As his business grew, so did their life together. The cramped apartment became a sleek downtown condo, then an expansive penthouse. Every promotion, every successful acquisition brought them closer to the life they had once dreamed of. Olivia had envisioned a future where they thrived as equals, where her contributions, both professional and personal, would be recognized. But something shifted. As Ethan's public profile grew, Olivia's presence in his world began to fade. The sharp businesswoman who once debated financial strategies with him over late-night coffee became, in his eyes, just his wife. The invitations to investor meetings stopped coming. The inside jokes they once shared about competitors and market trends disappeared. Instead, she found herself sitting quietly at dinner parties, smiling politely while Ethan's colleagues spoke over her, treating her as nothing more than an accessory to his success. She told herself it was temporary. That she was still part of this, just in a different way. So, she poured herself into supporting their life behind the scenes. While Ethan sealed high-profile deals, she managed everything else, their home, their schedules, their investments. She streamlined their expenses, negotiated vendor contracts, handled disputes, and even provided key insights that helped Ethan avoid financial pitfalls. She was the one ensuring that their life functioned seamlessly, that nothing fell through the cracks. And yet, none of it was acknowledged. The first time Ethan joked about her in public, she had laughed along, assuming it was harmless. "Oh, Olivia? She keeps herself entertained, yoga, shopping, some charity work here and there," he had said at a corporate dinner, dismissing her in front of his colleagues with a casual wave of his hand. The table had erupted in laughter. Olivia had felt the sting, but she swallowed it down. The second time, she felt the shift. It was another high-profile event, one she had planned herself, down to the seating arrangements and catering details. A journalist asked Ethan about his success and whether his wife had played a role in it. Ethan barely glanced in her direction before replying with a smirk, "She enjoys the lifestyle, I'll say that much." Laughter again. This time, it was harder to ignore. That night, as they returned home, Olivia asked him, "Why do you do that?" Why do you act like I don't contribute? Ethan had just shrugged, already distracted by his phone. It's not that serious, Liv. People don't care about that stuff. They care about what I do. And in that moment, she realized the truth. To him, she had already disappeared. The dinners, the late-night strategizing, the sacrifices, none of it mattered to him anymore. He had rewritten their story, positioning himself as the lone genius, the self-made man who had done it all on his own. But Olivia hadn't vanished. She was still there. And she wasn't done. Before I share what happened next, the moment that made the entire press gallery go silent, I want to connect with you, my incredible viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believed in, hit the like button, because this story is just getting started. The moment Olivia realized she was nothing more than a shadow in Ethan's world came on a night meant to celebrate his latest business triumph. It was a gala event, an extravagant affair held in one of the city's most prestigious hotels, the kind where crystal chandeliers cast golden light over silk-draped tables and a string quartet played softly in the background. Olivia had spent weeks preparing for the evening, not that anyone would ever know. The guest list, the seating arrangements, even the wine selection, all had passed through her hands. She made sure everything was flawless because that was what she did. She stood beside Ethan as they entered the ballroom, dressed in an elegant yet understated gown. She had chosen it carefully, ensuring she looked the part, a wife who complimented, never outshined. As they moved through the room, Olivia played her role to perfection, engaging in polite small talk, offering warm smiles, and subtly steering conversations in ways that benefited Ethan. Then came the moment that changed everything. A group of investors had gathered around Ethan, their glasses of aged bourbon in hand, discussing the brilliance of his latest acquisition. One of them, a man Olivia had met before but who clearly had no recollection of her, turned to Ethan with an amused smile. "And what about your lovely wife? What does she do with all her time?" It was an innocent enough question. A simple inquiry. But Olivia knew Ethan too well. She saw the flicker of amusement cross his face, the way his lips curved slightly before he delivered the punchline. "Oh, Olivia?" He let out a chuckle, his voice dripping with condescension. "She keeps herself entertained, some yoga, a bit of shopping, the occasional charity luncheon." The men around him laughed. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of their gazes, the dismissive smiles, the way none of them even thought to ask her the question directly. In their minds, Ethan's version of her was the truth, an indulgent, decorative presence in his life. She could have corrected him. She could have told them about the countless hours she spent managing the household finances, overseeing investments, handling logistics that kept their life seamless. She could have mentioned that she had played a role in many of the business deals Ethan was now being praised for, offering insights and advice that had helped shape his decisions. But she said nothing. Not because she agreed with him, but because she knew it wouldn't matter. Ethan had already written the script. He had spent years shaping the narrative that Olivia was nothing more than a fortunate bystander in his success story. If she spoke up now, she would seem bitter. Delusional. A woman trying too hard to prove her worth when, in their eyes, she had none. So, she smiled. A tight, practiced smile. She let the laughter roll over her like waves crashing against stone, eroding something inside her, piece by piece. The rest of the evening blurred into an exhausting haze of forced pleasantries and polite nods. Olivia excused herself early, claiming a headache, and left Ethan to bask in his glory. At home, she sat in the darkened living room, a single lamp casting a soft glow over the leather-bound journal resting on her lap. She opened it. Page after page, it held the truths she had been keeping track of for years. Notes detailing the deals she had facilitated. Records of financial strategies she had implemented. Emails showing the guidance she had provided, guidance Ethan had taken and claimed as his own. She ran her fingers over the ink, over the evidence of a life that had been erased in the eyes of the world. And then she made a decision. Ethan could laugh at her now. He could play the role of the self-made man and dismiss her as nothing more than a well-dressed ghost drifting through his world. But ghosts don't stay silent forever. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. That night, as Olivia sat in the dim glow of her living room, something inside her shifted. The humiliation at the gala had been a breaking point, but not in the way Ethan would have expected. He had spent years erasing her, reducing her to a supporting character in the empire they had built. But what he had never realized, what he had never even considered, was that Olivia had been paying attention. She wasn't just a silent observer. She had been learning. And now, she was going to use everything she knew to build something of her own. At first, it started as an escape. Late at night, while Ethan slept soundly in the master bedroom, Olivia sat in her office, the glow of her laptop illuminating her face as she dove into financial reports, investment strategies, and market trends. It had been years since she had actively worked in the business world, but the knowledge came back to her with surprising ease. Numbers had always made sense to her in a way that emotions never could. She began small, testing the waters with a few investments under an alias, placing calculated bets on startups and undervalued properties. While Ethan flaunted his latest acquisitions at extravagant parties, Olivia was making her own. The difference? Hers were done in silence. The more she learned, the more she saw opportunities Ethan had overlooked. He was flashy, reckless, always chasing the next big deal, the next headline-worthy success. Olivia, on the other hand, was patient. She knew that true power wasn't about being seen. It was about control. Months passed, and her portfolio grew. She didn't just invest, she built. With every calculated risk, every late-night research session, she was reclaiming the part of herself Ethan had tried to erase. The best part? He had no idea. He was too busy reveling in his own arrogance to notice that the woman he had dismissed was quietly outmaneuvering him. The turning point came when Olivia realized she could do more than just accumulate wealth, she could compete. Ethan had spent years dominating the real estate market, securing exclusive properties and forging alliances with influential developers. But while he was focused on expanding his public image, Olivia had been forging relationships of her own, ones he had been too blind to see. She established her own investment firm under the name Olivia Holdings, using the alias Olivia Carter. It was nothing more than a whisper in the financial world at first, a silent entity operating in the shadows. But that was how she wanted it. Because while Ethan was too busy basking in his own reflection, Olivia was positioning herself for the ultimate move. The irony? She had been quietly investing in his competitors all along. She bought shares in rising real estate firms he had scoffed at. She funded developers who had once been turned away from his office. She even acquired small but significant stakes in his own company, penny stocks that seemed meaningless on paper but would one day give her leverage where he least expected it. The deeper she went, the clearer the path became. She wasn't just preparing for an exit, she was preparing for war. And Ethan, in all his arrogance, was walking right into it. The final confirmation that she was on the right path came one evening at another of his infamous business dinners. She had long stopped expecting acknowledgement from him, but what happened that night sealed her resolve. A junior executive, eager to impress, leaned in with a grin. "Ethan, you're a genius. The way you pivoted your firm into commercial investments this year, it was a masterstroke." Ethan smirked, raising his glass. "What can I say? Vision is everything." Olivia sat silently, the corners of her lips barely moving as she took a slow sip of wine. Because what none of them knew, what Ethan himself hadn't even realized, was that the strategy he had just been praised for? It was hers. Months ago, when she had seen the shift in market trends, Olivia had made a subtle suggestion over dinner, phrased so casually that Ethan barely noticed it. He had dismissed it at the time, but weeks later, when the idea somehow resurfaced in his mind, he ran with it, believing it was his own. And now, here he was, reaping the praise for it. It didn't matter anymore. She no longer needed his recognition. Because soon, when she made her final move, he would see exactly how much he had underestimated her. But before that moment came, she had to wait. Because the most powerful moves aren't made in haste. They are made in silence, at precisely the right time. And Olivia Carter was almost ready. It happened on a night that should have been like any other. A routine evening in a life Olivia had spent years perfecting, keeping the house in order, ensuring Ethan's schedule ran smoothly, playing the role of the effortless wife while secretly building something of her own. But that night, something changed. She was in the walk-in closet, putting away Ethan's freshly dry-cleaned suits when her fingers brushed against something unfamiliar in the pocket of his jacket, a folded receipt, crisp and new. At first, she barely registered it. Just another expense, another overpriced dinner with investors, perhaps. But when she glanced at the details, her pulse slowed. A 5-star hotel. A private suite. The date, just 3 nights ago, when Ethan had claimed to be on a business trip out of state. For a long moment, Olivia just stood there, staring at the slip of paper between her fingers. She knew. Deep down, she had always known. Ethan wasn't the type to be satisfied with anything he thought he had conquered. That had been clear from the way he treated his business, his investments, and now, her. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Rage wouldn't serve her here. Neither would confrontation, not yet. Instead, she slipped the receipt into the pocket of her own blazer and walked out of the closet, her expression unreadable. Downstairs, she found Ethan in his study, his tie loosened, a glass of bourbon in his hand as he scrolled through his phone. When he looked up at her, there wasn't even a flicker of guilt in his eyes. Just vague impatience, as if she had already overstayed her welcome in the space he considered his own. "Something wrong?" he asked, setting his glass down with a soft clink. Olivia tilted her head slightly, searching his face for any sign that he might offer her an explanation, a lie, even a weak excuse. Nothing. Just that same casual arrogance, the unwavering belief that he was untouchable. She reached into her pocket and placed the receipt on the desk in front of him. "Explain this." Ethan barely glanced at it before exhaling a slow, amused breath. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw as if she had just asked him something mildly inconvenient, like whether he had remembered to take out the trash. "Liv, really? You're snooping through my things now?" She didn't blink. "That's your response?" He shrugged. "If you actually contributed something to this marriage, maybe you'd have less time to dig through my pockets." The words landed like a slap, but Olivia didn't flinch. She had spent years letting Ethan dictate what was real, allowing him to rewrite their history, to shape the world's perception of her until even she began to question her own worth. But not anymore. She didn't scream. Didn't cry. She only nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself, and then turned on her heel, walking out of the room before he could say anything else. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to explain herself. She had already made her decision. That night, while Ethan slept soundly beside her, Olivia reached for her phone and pulled up an encrypted email thread, one she had started months ago with a lawyer she had researched in secret. A lawyer who specialized in high-stakes divorces. Her fingers hovered over the screen for only a moment before she typed 2 words. "I'm ready." The next morning, she made a quiet call to the bank, ensuring that her personal accounts, ones Ethan didn't even know existed, were secure. She arranged meetings with financial advisors, finalized silent partnerships, and ensured that every investment she had made in the shadows was locked in place. By the time she stepped out of her home office, nothing in her expression betrayed the war she was preparing to wage. Ethan, meanwhile, was completely unaware. Oblivious, even, as he kissed her on the cheek that evening, murmuring, "Dinner with investors tonight. Don't wait up." Olivia only smiled. She had no intention of waiting. Because in just a few short weeks, he would finally understand the weight of everything he had taken for granted. And when he did, when he realized that the woman he had dismissed had been holding up his entire empire, it would be far too late. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later. Delivered not by Ethan himself, but by a courier, impersonal, efficient, a reflection of exactly how little he thought of her. Olivia stood at the kitchen counter, holding the thick envelope in her hands, running her fingers over the embossed firm name at the top. She wasn't surprised. Ethan had always been a man who made the first move, a strategist who enjoyed controlling the board. Filing first was his way of dictating the terms, ensuring he held the upper hand before she even had the chance to react. But what he didn't realize, what he had never realized, was that Olivia had been preparing for this far longer than he had. That night, as she sat across from her attorney, reviewing the documents, she almost laughed at the arrogance of it all. "He's offering you next to nothing," her lawyer, Claire Montgomery, said, flipping through the pages with a practiced, unimpressed glance. "A modest cash settlement, no share in his business, and the house, if you agree to sign an NDA." Olivia leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping against the wooden table. "He really thinks I'll just take it and walk away?" Claire smirked. "He thinks you're exactly who he's painted you to be. A woman with no resources, no skills, no power. Dependent on him until the very end." Olivia exhaled slowly. She had spent years letting Ethan define her. Letting him decide which parts of her story were worth telling, which parts were worth discarding. But now? Now, she was the one holding the pen. The day of the first court hearing, Olivia walked into the room with quiet confidence, dressed in a sleek, dark suit that fit her like armor. She felt the weight of every eye on her, from the legal teams to the handful of journalists lingering at the back, waiting to witness the clean, effortless disposal of yet another billionaire's wife. Ethan was already seated, relaxed in his chair, exuding the same effortless charm that had fooled the world for years. He barely looked at her as she took her place beside Claire. To him, this was a formality, something to check off his list before moving on to the next phase of his life. The judge entered, the murmurs died down, and then, for the first time in years, Olivia spoke in a room where Ethan had to listen. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I would like to present additional evidence regarding the financial contributions made throughout our marriage," she said, her voice steady. Ethan finally turned his head toward her, his brows drawing together slightly, not in fear, but in mild annoyance, like a man interrupted mid-game. His lawyer, an older man who had been handling high-profile divorces for decades, let out a soft chuckle. "Your Honor, with all due respect, Mrs. Carter has never had an official role in my client's business affairs. Her financial contributions are non-existent." Olivia's lips barely moved as she set a thick file on the table. "Then let's take a look, shall we?" The courtroom fell silent as Claire slid the documents toward the judge. Inside were years of records, emails, spreadsheets, bank transfers, investment statements. Not only did they prove that Olivia had played a direct role in managing and advising Ethan's business, but they also revealed something even more damning. She hadn't just invested in real estate. She had invested in his competitors. The realization hit Ethan like a slow-moving wrecking ball. His smirk faltered as he leaned forward, flipping through the pages, his jaw tightening with every line he read. "This?" He stopped, exhaling sharply through his nose. "This is ridiculous." But it wasn't. Because there it was, in black and white, Olivia had quietly acquired minority stakes in multiple firms that had been positioning themselves against his. She had funded startups, brokered deals, facilitated mergers that had, without his knowledge, directly weakened his leverage in the market. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs. Ethan's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something urgent, but Ethan didn't react. He was still staring at the documents, processing the one thing he had never once considered. Olivia had never been weak. She had never been dependent. She had been waiting. The judge cleared her throat, drawing the room back to order. "Given this new information, the court will need time to assess the extent of Mrs. Carter's contributions to the marital estate. We will reconvene in 2 weeks." As the session adjourned, Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. For the first time since this process had begun, he looked at her. Really looked at her. "You set me up," he muttered under his breath as she gathered her things. Olivia smiled. a soft, knowing smile. "No, Ethan," she said, meeting his gaze with steady resolve. "I just stopped letting you win." Then she turned and walked out, leaving him sitting in the wreckage of his own overconfidence. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from boredom or distraction, but the kind that settled deep, a silence so heavy, so absolute, that it felt like the air itself had thickened with anticipation. Olivia stood, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. Across the aisle, Ethan sat rigid, his hands clasped together, his confidence finally showing its cracks. He wasn't smirking anymore. She had waited for this moment. For years, she had been erased, diminished to nothing more than his wife, a background character in the empire they had built together. And now, for the first time, she had the stage. Not in his shadow. Not behind the scenes. But center stage, where her voice could no longer be ignored. She inhaled deeply, then spoke. "For years, I was told my contributions didn't matter. That I was fortunate to live the life my husband provided. That my efforts were invisible, my sacrifices irrelevant." She lifted a document from the thick stack on the table before her. "But invisibility doesn't mean absence. And silence doesn't mean ignorance. While my husband played the role of the self-made man, I was making the very decisions that kept his empire intact." The judge leaned forward slightly. Ethan's lawyer shifted in his seat, his fingers curling into a tight grip around his pen. Olivia's voice remained calm, measured. "I was the one overseeing our investments. I was the one restructuring assets when deals were on the verge of collapse. And when my husband's company faced liquidity crises not once, but twice, I was the one who stepped in, discreetly, quietly, making sure everything he had built didn't crumble beneath him." She let that sink in for a moment before she reached for another file. And yet, when he stood before his colleagues, his investors, the world, he laughed. "He called me a housewife who spent her time on hobbies and shopping. He dismissed me in front of rooms full of people, ensuring that my presence was reduced to nothing more than an ornament in his life. But here's what he never realized, the money that saved him? It came from me." Ethan shifted, a muscle ticking in his jaw. His lawyer murmured something to him, but he didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the document Olivia had just placed in front of the judge. It was a financial record, clear, undeniable proof that she had personally funneled funds from her private investment firm into his business, saving him from ruin without him ever knowing. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the journalists in the back, who had spent the last few weeks framing her as the discarded wife of a powerful CEO, were suddenly scribbling furiously in their notepads. Olivia turned to face the judge directly. "I am not asking for recognition. I am not asking for sympathy. I am here to reclaim what was always mine." She gestured toward the stack of evidence, a meticulously compiled record of every decision, every strategy, every late-night calculation that had built and sustained Ethan's empire. "Because the truth is, my husband didn't build his success alone. And if this court acknowledges his work, then it must acknowledge mine." The judge took a deep breath, flipping through the documents, her expression unreadable. But the weight of it, the undeniability of it, was there. Ethan's lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor, while these claims may be compelling, they do not negate the fact that Mr. Reed was the public face of." The judge held up a hand. "Enough." Her gaze flickered between Ethan and Olivia. "Mrs. Carter has presented substantial evidence that requires thorough review. Given the magnitude of these claims, I will be issuing a court recess while we evaluate the full scope of her financial involvement in the marital estate." A pause. Then, a final blow. "And I strongly suggest both parties prepare for a very different outcome than what was initially expected." Ethan's face was pale. His confidence, his arrogance, was gone. For the first time, he looked at Olivia not as a woman he could control. Not as a woman he could dismiss. But as a woman who had just rewritten the narrative he had built his entire life upon. As the gavel struck, signaling the adjournment, Olivia gathered her documents. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. When she finally met Ethan's gaze, she saw what she had been waiting for. Not anger. Not even defiance. Fear. Because for the first time, he knew he had lost. The fallout was swift. By the time Olivia walked out of the courthouse, the cracks in Ethan's carefully constructed empire had already begun to spread. The courtroom doors had barely shut behind her before the media swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, eager to capture the story they hadn't seen coming. For weeks, they had painted her as the cast-aside wife, another forgotten woman left in the wake of a powerful man's ambition. But now? Now, they saw something else. They saw the woman who had been there all along. The headlines changed overnight. The wife behind the empire, Olivia Carter's secret influence on Reed Enterprises. Self-made or wife-made? How one woman silently built a fortune beneath her husband's feet. Billionaire CEO faces public reckoning after shocking courtroom twist. At first, Ethan tried to dismiss it. Sensationalism, he scoffed to his legal team. People will forget in a week. But they didn't. Because what Olivia had revealed in court wasn't just a legal battle, it was a public unraveling. Investors grew nervous. Stocks wavered. Clients who once flocked to Ethan's firm now hesitated, whispering behind closed doors, wondering how much of his success had truly been his own. The real blow came when Olivia's financial records were made public through court filings. She hadn't just contributed, she had been essential. For years, she had made quiet, strategic investments that had protected his company from collapse. She had secured deals Ethan had taken credit for. She had managed logistics he had never even bothered to understand. And when all of that was stripped away, when she was no longer there to hold the foundation together, it all started to fall apart. One by one, his board members began resigning. One by one, his investors pulled out. The company Ethan had spent years building, the one he had so proudly claimed as his own, was now collapsing beneath the weight of his arrogance. Olivia never spoke to the press. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. But Ethan? He wasn't handling the scrutiny well. At first, he tried to control the narrative, calling an emergency press conference to clarify the situation. He stood before the cameras, his suit impeccable, his tone carefully measured. Let's be clear, my wife played a role in our success, but the company was and always has been my vision. It should have worked. It would have worked. If not for the journalist in the front row, holding up a file. Mr. Reed, these documents show that in two separate financial crises, your wife's private investments were the only thing keeping Reed Enterprises solvent. Are you saying you were unaware? Ethan's jaw tightened. For the first time in his career, he had no answer. The silence stretched. The cameras clicked. And then, the headlines changed again. Ethan Reed speechless after journalist exposes business lifeline. Who really built Reed Enterprises? The answer might shock you. Billionaire CEO's reputation crumbles as divorce trial reveals hidden truths. The board members who had once supported him now distanced themselves. The clients who had once trusted him now looked elsewhere. And the investors who had once bet on him no longer saw a sure thing. By the time the final ruling came down in court, Ethan wasn't the same man who had walked in weeks before, cocky, untouchable, convinced of his victory. He sat with his lawyer, his face pale, his hands clenched as the judge delivered the verdict. Olivia was awarded half of everything. Not just the assets. Not just the properties. But the recognition. The ruling acknowledged her as a key financial contributor to the company, her work, her investments, her sacrifices. It was the first time, in a legally binding document, that her name was written beside his. It was the validation Ethan had spent years denying her. And for him? It was his greatest humiliation. By the time Olivia stepped out of the courthouse, the reporters were no longer asking about Ethan's success. They were asking about hers. Because she hadn't just survived this divorce. She had won. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden streaks across the city skyline as Olivia stepped onto the balcony of her new penthouse. The air was crisp, carrying the hum of distant traffic and the scent of fresh coffee from the cafe below. But unlike before, there was no tension in her shoulders, no silent weight pressing down on her chest. For the first time in years, she could breathe. The divorce had been finalized weeks ago, but the ripple effects of it were still unfolding. Ethan's downfall wasn't a dramatic explosion, it was a slow, relentless collapse, piece by piece, as the foundation of his empire crumbled beneath him. His company had barely survived the media storm, but not without consequences. Clients pulled out, stockholders lost faith, and board members who once sang his praises now distanced themselves. The man who had once commanded every room he walked into now struggled to hold on to what little control he had left. And Olivia? She had stepped out of the shadows and into the life she had always deserved. Her name was no longer buried beneath Ethan's. No longer a footnote in his story. It stood on its own, attached to a growing list of investments, partnerships, and philanthropic ventures. The money she had built in silence, the empire she had quietly cultivated, was now fully hers. She had spent years making choices based on what suited Ethan, molding herself to fit into the life he wanted. But now, every decision was her own. And with that freedom came something unexpected: peace. She had no desire to waste time on revenge. No interest in proving anything to Ethan or the people who had dismissed her. Because her success wasn't about them. It was about her. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. Subject: Invitation to speak at the Women in Finance Summit. Olivia's lips curled into a small smile. For years, she had been silent. Had watched as men like Ethan took credit for the work of women like her. But not anymore. She picked up her phone, fingers hovering over the keyboard for only a moment before she typed a single word. Accepted. Down in the cafe below, people bustled about, lost in their own lives, unaware of the woman standing above them, a woman who had once been invisible, but who had now reclaimed her voice, her power, and her future. And as Olivia turned back to the city stretched out before her, she knew one thing for certain. She was never going to be erased again.